Welcome to another episode of the Tunepact Podcast. I'm your host, the punk rock pop, Leigh Pierce. Today we're starting a two-part series on legal issues in music marketing. And today the first episode will be about intellectual property for creatives. We're lucky enough to be joined by singer-songwriter, musician, and entertainment lawyer, Bryan Kroes.
Hey, thanks for having me, Leigh. I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I started playing music when I was 14, toured a bunch in a variety of different bands, all the way ranging from hardcore punk to country. Currently front a more of a folk alt-country group called the Slow Harvest. But my day job, and the reason I'm here today, is because I am an entertainment attorney with Hurtado Zimmerman SC, which is located in Wisconsin. So as an entertainment attorney, I have the privilege, and it's a high privilege at that, of working with all facets of the entertainment industry, and not just folks in Wisconsin. I do have clients who are all over the United States. So, I will represent musicians, labels, music and book publishers, authors, venues, entertainment-adjacent entities like breweries and hospitality entities, and recently quite a few content creators and influencers who are making quite a big splash with all of our online social media platforms. So that's my bread and butter of my practice, and I think it's very important for folks who are doing any of that to know what they need to know on the business side. It's one thing to be a creative; it's another thing to know how your creativity can be protected and how you can use it to essentially have a business, and a robust one at that, for yourself.
All right, well, let's get into it here. So I know one of the biggest issues is copyright and trademark, but the problem with that is everybody on the planet has heard of copyright and trademark. They kind of know what it is, but nobody really knows what it does and what falls under each. Could you give us just the basics on what are the difference of those?
Sure. So intellectual property, when we use that term, can mean a variety of different things. There's copyrights, there's trademarks, there's also patents, and there's trade secrets. Trade secrets, think of the KFC recipe or the Coca-Cola recipe. Somebody knows it, it's a secret, you don't divulge it. That doesn't really get applied to music very often, or entertainment. The patent side of things, that's really your processes. Quite often that could be used in biotech or some sort of engineering sphere. Again, not really pertinent to entertainment. Where we thrive is in copyrights and trademarks. The copyrights are going to be things like music, so both the composition and the sound recording. We'll talk about the distinction between those two in a moment. And then pantomimes, choreography, visual arts, so anything that somebody can create using a brush or a pen or any other medium, but also photography, and even architectural works are covered by copyright. Trademarks are source designators. So we're thinking brands here. The Starbucks logo, the McDonald's logo, even the names Starbucks, McDonald's are source designators, and they're brands. In the entertainment world, we're talking group names and individuals as performers, bands, label names, and the brand's logos and other things that designate those entities or those people. Interestingly enough, it doesn't have to just be stuff you can see. Smells and certain sounds can also be trademarks.
I had no idea. That's pretty cool.
It is. It's fun stuff. It's much better than certain other areas of the law that can be a little bit more dry.
Yeah. So now you talk about copyrights. What is the difference? You're talking about, the sound recordings, the composition. What is the differences and what musicians need to know about that?
Sure. So there's actually, in every song that you can imagine, there are going to be two copyrights. The first copyright is going to be the composition copyright. That's going to be the words and the music. If it's an instrumental, it's just going to be the music. If it's a spoken word, it's just going to be the words. But typically, it's going to be a combination of those two things together. There is also the embodiment, the physical embodiment of those words and music. That is the sound recording. So an example I always give when I'm teaching this kind of stuff is Dolly Parton's I Will Always Love You. I think a lot of people know that song. So Dolly Parton wrote I Will Always Love You. So Dolly Parton, and I'm gonna speak, there's publishers and record labels involved in all this stuff too. I'll get into that in a moment, but just for simplicity's sake, Dolly Parton wrote the words and music to I Will Always Love You. Dolly Parton owns the composition copyright in I Will Always Love You. Dolly Parton recorded her own version of I Will Always Love You. Now Dolly Parton owns both the composition and a sound recording copyright. So 2 copyrights in I Will Always Love You. Whitney Houston went and recorded a version of I Will Always Love You. So now Whitney Houston owned the sound recording copyright for her version of I Will Always Love You, but does not own the composition copyright for Dolly Parton's I Will Always Love You or anything having to do with the sound recording of Dolly Parton's version of that. I could go record my own version of I Will Always Love You, and Leigh, you could record your own version of I Will Always Love You. And we'll have sound recording copyrights in those works, but we will never have a composition copyright. So it's kind of an easy way to think that the composition copyright is the one and only thing that you're going to have there. The sound recording copyrights, there can be many of them.
Excuse me.
Now, typically, a composition copyright is going to be owned by the person who writes it. That could be one person. It could be multiple people if there's a group of songwriters. But there's also publishers. In the music business, there's publishers who will work a catalog, is what they call it, and they get the music out to record labels and other industries that will be using that composition. So very often the publisher, the music publisher, is going to want to own that composition copyright. In the same vein, labels, as we know them, which is basically just a business entity that is out there for the purposes of exploiting music, and in entertainment, the word exploitation is a good thing. They are going to try to own the sound recordings of those copyrights. The reason it's a pretty simple way of thinking about it. Especially if you go to like a Target or a Walmart nowadays, you see records from years ago because people are really loving this resurgence of vinyl. I can walk into Target and I can see a Nirvana record. Well, the label doesn't have to go back and ask, because they own the sound recording copyrights. They don't have to go back and ask for permission every time to repress these things. They just say, we own them. And so now we can do whatever we want with them. It's a very common practice. A lot of moral and ethical issues that are adjacent to that. We're not going to get into that today, about whether or not you want to own your own materials. But really, when you think about who owns the stuff, who owns the copyrights, it's going to be the publishers owning the composition copyrights and the record labels owning the sound recording copyrights.
And when it comes with copyrights, is that something that once you do have the copyright, is that something that lasts for, like, how long does that last? Is that something that has to be renewed, or is it, because you hear a lot about public domain, especially so many bigger art pieces, whether it's movies, music, hitting public domain the last few years. So, like, how long does the copyright last?
Yeah, so now there's a copyright, a version of the copyright code that existed up until the 70s. I could get into the nuances of it, but there was a lot of different renewal and registration elements and publication elements of that pre-70s copyright. We don't have to worry about that nowadays. It's been simplified quite a bit, that anything nowadays that's created has the same track. So it's 70 years. The copyright lasts for 70 years from the moment of creation. And it's 95 years for works made for hire. There's certain little variations in there, but those are the main things that you need to remember. But it's a long time. I mean, 70 years is a long time. And if you're co-writing with somebody, it's going to be 70 years from the death of the last artist. So, I mean, there's quite a bit of duration there that you have to worry about in copyright. So that's also why sometimes publishers and record labels are going to want to own these things. But it means you can also exploit them for a very long period of time.
Okay, and now when it comes to copyrights, like, how does it work for the musician themselves? Like, what benefits will you see as a musician if you get into doing the copywriting and make sure you're doing everything the right way?
Sure. So copyrights, are very important. So I know we started this thing off talking about how labels are going to try to own certain copyrights and publishers are going to try to own other ones. But realistically, the majority of songs that are being created today are being created by independent musicians, folks just like you or me who are writing with either ourselves or our friends. And we are essentially, we are copyright owners from the moment that work is created. It's actually kind of a funny misconception. You don't need to register your copyright to have a copyright. The copyright actually is granted in you the moment that it is fixed in a tangible medium. And we're not talking about drafts. We're not talking about going back and forth and reworking something. We're talking about like, hey, this song is done, or we are confident that this recording is done. The copyright starts at that moment. The registration is the confirmation to the world and grants you certain rights, such as the right to get statutory damages and attorney's fees if somebody were to use that copyright without your permission. But really, what copyright allows you to do, allows you to own it to the exclusion of all others. It allows you to exploit it, and we said that exploitation is a good thing in entertainment. So it means you can put it out there. You can do whatever the hell you want with it. You can license it. You can sell it. You can assign it. You can create derivative works. You want to make a movie, for example, an audio-visual work. Great. I can make the original one. I can make a sequel. You can make spin-offs, part 1, part 2. Think of all the things that exist out there that are based on something. Those are considered derivative works. So by owning a copyright, you can do all of that stuff. Now, realistically, when you are a musician who is not affiliated with a publisher, if you're creating this composition, you're your own publisher. So you essentially stand in the place where a publisher would, and then you can exploit your work just like a publisher would. A musician may also act as their own label and could exploit the work like a label would. And sometimes you can do what's called a work made for hire, which you heard me talk about with the duration of the 95-year work made for hire. Work made for hire really means that somebody's hiring you to do something, hiring you to make the work for them. And in that case, you don't ever own it. They own it. So a great example is just in any kind of industry. Like, let's say I get a job. This is just an example. I get a job at Harley Davidson. Harley Davidson wants me to create a marketing set for them. Or maybe I get a job at Sony, even better, because we're talking about music here. Sony wants me to create a marketing set for them. Well, now that marketing is going to be owned by Harley Davidson or Sony, not me as the individual creator. And if there's a work made for hire agreement, which there typically is in those scenarios, that company then is going to own it and can exploit it rather than the individual person who creates it.
Okay, so we know how copyrights benefit. How do you actually do it? Like, how do you register? Like, I have no idea where to even look. And it's one of those topics. You look it up online, and there's so much information, it's hard to sift through it. So, what are some basics that we should know about just how to register your work?
Sure. So there's The old way was a paper application, and that was kind of maybe one of the impediments to people registering their copyrights, because I got to do an application, I got to send it in. The Copyright Office has really streamlined that process. There's an electronic copyright office. It's called the ECO for short. You create a login like you would on any other website, and you go in and you have your own little dashboard there, and you can start to register all of your works. It's a very intuitive website. I mean, every website is going to have some parts that you have to learn as you're going, but I've been doing this long enough that it's intuitive to me, and I think it will become intuitive to anybody who wants to use it. But basically, it's a wizard. It takes you through each step. I want to register a song. Okay, great. Now we're going to enter who is the author. Now we're going to go to the next screen. Who is the owner? Who gets contacted for rights and permissions? When was it created? That kind of stuff. And then you pay a fee at the end. There's a $65 registration fee. These fees do change sometimes, so depending on when you're watching this, if it's in the future, these fees may not be completely accurate. But generally, there's a fee for one work, and then there's also sometimes bundles of fees that you can get for, like, say I want to register an album's worth of music, or I want to register a bunch of unpublished works. I can do that for a deal. In one example, I can register 10 unpublished works for $85. Well, that's a significant deal than registering 10 individual works for $65.
Oh, wow.
So you can do those things, and the nice thing about it is right online, and if it's there are some things that you have to send a physical copy into the Copyright Office, like, for example, if you're registering an entire album, but quite often you can just upload like an MP3, or if it's a visual work of art, a JPEG or a PDF. Even architectural works, if they're small enough and they work enough within the confines of the parameters that the Copyright Office has set out for their submission requirements, you can just upload the stuff. So you don't have to actually go down to the post office and do that. So it's pretty easy to get a copyright. Now, it does take a little bit of time. It can be 3 months, sometimes 6 months for it to get processed, because there's just a big volume of that stuff getting processed. But the nice thing is that I have found, and I hope this will stay true for the future, the folks at the Copyright Office are very helpful. This isn't like calling customer service at a credit card company where you get the runaround, or an insurance company where you get the runaround. Every time I've ever contacted the Copyright Office and said, "Hey, I've got a question. I've got a pending application and it hasn't been fixed yet, or it hasn't been registered yet, or I have a question about something that's just odd," they are always so helpful and so nice. So it's one of those things, like, if you have a question about it, and you don't have an attorney like myself, or a manager or somebody, and you want to ask a question of the Copyright Office, by all means go ahead, because they are that helpful.
Okay, so now we covered why you get a copyright, what it covers, how to do it, how to register it. What do you do after you've got your copyright? Like, what's the next step then?
So then you get to enforce your copyright. Realistically speaking, copyright infringement is, although we talk about it a lot, we talk about registering it so we can protect it, there's not as much rampant copyright infringement going on as you would think. Yes, there is copyright infringement going on, and that's why we do it, but it's not like this endemic problem. But if you should find that someone has exploited your work or a portion thereof, and you want to enforce your copyright, having that registration gives prima facie evidence that you actually have the copyright, have the rights to use that work, and you are the owner of it to the exclusion of all others. So there's no question. Somebody can't say, well, yeah, you created this thing in 2000, but you never registered it, So this sounds kind of suspicious to me, and maybe that would be a defense in a litigation. The other thing that's really beneficial is it allows you statutory damages rather than actual damages and attorney's fees. And I'll take those in, those are two different components. But say somebody is infringing on your work. Now, especially with music, we know that streaming doesn't make you a lot of money. And so say somebody was streaming a song of yours, or maybe they created a work out of your composition and incorporated it into their song, and now they were exploiting it, and you wanted to address a copyright infringement claim against them. You would have to essentially prove what's called actual damages. How much did they really make off of doing this? So, okay, great. They had 100 streams, big deal. It's not going to get you any actual money. But if you go for statutory damages, it's a fixed amount of money that's on actually a sliding scale that can very often times may exceed the amount of actual damages, and it's essentially a guaranteed amount if you should win your copyright action. I underscore if you should win. So, but it's nice because it's not like, hey, I have to figure out how much they made off of this one. I have an amount that I can look to that's enshrined in statute. The other part's attorney's fees. So, many states and the copyright world, which is a federal law, go by what's called the American rule. American rule basically means everybody's covering their own attorney's fees in a dispute. And there are some exceptions to that, statutes, contracts. Well, by registering your work under the copyright law, if you should have to go through the copyright enforcement process by filing an action to enforce it, and you win again, you could get your attorney's fees. So that's a significant amount of money because attorney's fees can really add up quickly in those situations. And if you're not guaranteed that you're going to get your attorney's fees, then what's even the point? I've underscored like if you win, because none of this stuff is certain. I mean, you can make a claim to somebody and they may hire an attorney and they may defend it. They may argue with you about the validity of your copyright. But these are remedies that are available to you and that you can use to basically say, hey, if I win this thing, I could be entitled to actual damages and attorney's fees. So let's figure out a way to work this out to the benefit of both of us. There's also something new and I say new, but I mean it's several years old now. But it was a thing called the Case Act, which is essentially a small claims version of large claims copyright court, which allowed people who had claims under a certain amount to bring those claims in a small claims type of action. It's designed to really make enforcement a little bit more accessible to people who may not have widespread copyright infringement issues or large-scale copyright infringement issues. So it's something that's available and just another way to help you enforce your copyright. But, I mean, that's essentially copyrights in a very quick nutshell.
Yeah, that was a real nice boot camp for copyright. So, you talked a little at the beginning about the difference between copyright and trademark, but let's actually dig into trademarks now. So, like, exactly, what are they and what do they protect?
Sure. So, trademarks can be of state or federal creation. So, I'm in Wisconsin. Wisconsin does have a state trademark. And then there's also the federal trademark, which is designed to protect things across, basically use an interstate commerce. That's the federal trademark. When you see something that's got the little TM next to it, maybe it's a name, it's got a little TM, that's a designation that something is a trademark that maybe hasn't been registered yet. If you see the R with the circle around it, that means it's been registered with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the USPTO for short. And trademarks are source designators. It's the whole purpose is to create a system where consumers will not be confused as to the source of goods. If you see I used the example earlier, a Starbucks logo, you know you're getting Starbucks. You know you're going to go to a Starbucks in Kansas versus a Starbucks in New York, and it's going to be relatively the same thing. Now, how that applies to music is your band names or your record label names, your publishing company names, performing names, things that make you distinct, that make you stand out from all other people. Imagine, and I know we have this, actually, I just did an entire talk to other attorneys on legal issues with cover bands, or tribute bands, I should say, because tribute bands are using somebody else's trademark to create a whole experience that they then exploit. And it's everybody's doing it, but a lot of people aren't doing it with the intention of deceiving people into thinking that they're going to see the real band. They know, hey, if I'm going to see someone, I can't think of a name off the top of my head, but if I'm going to see a tribute band, I know it's not going to be the real band. But now, what happened if you saw a flyer and it said a name of a very famous band on it? Would you be duped as a consumer into thinking, well, hey, maybe I'm actually going to see that real band? And so as a musician or as a record label or anybody that's working in the music industry, having that distinction is very, very important, because you don't want people going out there and thinking, oh, I'm going to see so and so, when in fact you're not. The most difficult part of it is when you start to see these fractioning off of groups. And we'll talk about some of this in our part 2. So foreshadowing here. But part 2 is basically music business basics, where we talk about how to work with your band members to know who's going to own the rights to the name once it's done, once the band is done. But I mean, just think about bands that have fractioned off. We've got, Misfits, Dead Kennedys,
Black Flag, yeah, all the old school punk bands have factioned off. There's like 3 versions of the same band, but who's using the name and who has the rights?
Right. And so if you go to see, like I just saw a thing for the Dead Kennedys getting, it was a tour announcement for the Dead Kennedys. If you know that particular iteration, and I'm using it in quotes, of the Dead Kennedys is playing, well, you know what you're going to get. But if you're going to, and you're expecting that you're going to see Jello Biafra fronting the Dead Kennedys, you may feel like you were duped. So that's where trademark really comes in, and that's why it's important to understand who owns the name and to have this trademark protection. So, how can musicians use trademarks? Well, trademarks are granted through use. The registration, kind of like copyrights, the registration confirms that you have the trademark. But you really have to start using it first. There is a nuance where you can register a name on an intent to use basis. Basically, you're reserving the name. But you're telling the USPTO when you are applying for your trademark, hey, I'm using this name. I'm using this name for entertainment services, or I'm using this name for sound recordings. And then you register that name as a source designator in that particular class of goods and services, like I just said, entertainment services or sound recordings. That then gives you, the musician, the exclusive right to use your name to the exclusion of all others. So now if somebody wants to come out and create a band using a name that's substantially similar or exactly similar, you have the right, once you've obtained that trademark, to say, no, you can't, that's my name, and it will create consumer confusion if you do that. The distinction that should be made here is that the USPTO divides trademarks into classes of goods and services. Goods being tangible things that you can hold, that you can own. Services being things that other people do for others. So while you can't have 2 of the exact name in the same class of goods and services, you can have the same name in different classes of goods and services. A simple example is Dove. You can have Dove chocolate, you can have Dove soap, but you can't have the same. So with musicians, typically there's going to be multiple classes of goods and services that are invoked. Class 41 is for entertainment services. There's other things in Class 41, but in general, Class 41 is for your entertainment services. That's you going out, playing on a stage, playing to others, showing people that you are actively, playing. Class 9 is for sound recordings. That's, hey, I'm the band, I'm recording stuff onto my sound recordings and selling it to you, and that's it. My protection ends right there. It doesn't extend any further into the performance of it. So there are occasions where a band may say, well, I don't perform out, so I don't have a big budget, so I just want to go and register in Class 9 for sound recordings. Or vice versa. There's some bands that say, hey, we are maybe a cover band only, or we're only a live band. We're never going to record. We want to only do the live performance, Class 41, entertainment services. Record labels, they're going to have their own class, which does include Class 9 as well. Publishing companies, even producers can register for a trademark. Now the key is your name does have to be distinct, and it does have to be, there's certain requirements that you have to maintain. You can't just go name, there's the band, right? Or the. Now they have gained notoriety over the years, which is called secondary meaning, where it's not just going out from scratch saying, hey, I'm going to protect the name of the band for a band, or entertainment services for entertainment services, or even better, chair for chair. It has to be distinctive enough that it is afforded protection under the copyright law. And there is like a scale of distinctiveness that you have to consider. Oftentimes, though, many band names are going to be distinctive enough. Individual musicians can also, like if it's, so-and-so, whatever, first name, last name, can also register their name as a trademark. You have to establish that a little bit more, because names are admittedly a little bit more difficult. Certain names, once they've gained that secondary meaning, when people recognize that there's only one Sam Smith, for example. Sam Smith is a very common name, but at this point, when you think Sam Smith, Sam Smith, the singer, rather than Sam Smith from wherever, Minneapolis. There are some distinctions there, but with a certain amount of notoriety, you can also register your individual name as a trademark.
All right, and how important is it to register trademarks before you start marketing, whether it's a new project, whether it's a recording or an upcoming event?
So, you don't have to, kind of like the copyright thing we talked about, you don't have to register anything, but the registration itself grants you some protections. It grants you the ability to say, I own this to the exclusion of all others, and there is no question about it. I've litigated cases like this where I've had my client has had a valid trademark, registered trademark, and we can go in to the court and say, we have this registered trademark, here's our paperwork. You said it in front of in the pleading, basically, and it streamlines things much quicker. Nobody's saying, well, I don't think you really own this name, or I think maybe I owned it, I was using it before you did, or maybe you abandoned the name, because there is an abandonment thing where if you don't use a name for 3 years, it's abandoned and it's fair game for anybody to use. So there are benefits to registering a name before you start to market, because it's essentially saying, hey, I've got exclusive use of this name, and all y'all may want to use it, but you don't have a right to.
All right, so let's wrap up this episode with, we talked about the copyright, you've got it. So now you're an artist, you've got your recordings, you've got your composition, you've got a name, you've got a logo. So now you've got your trademark. Like, what's your next step? Like, what does that mean to you as the artist?
Yeah, so much like copyrights, you have to enforce it. And trademarks are a little bit more strict in the sense of you must enforce your trademark, otherwise you could lose it. There's what's called genericide. It sounds awful, and it kind of is. I mean, if you're the one that's experiencing it, but basically it means that your name goes generic. Escalators used to be a trademark; they are now generic. Murphy beds used to be a trademark. Any bed that folds up into a wall is now a Murphy bed. When I work, years ago, I used to work selling copy machines, and one of my many jobs. And I remember Xerox used to run ads in back when they had print. Xerox would run these ads that basically said, a Xerox is a Xerox. It's not a Konica. It's not a Kyocera. Don't confuse anything with a Xerox. And that's because people tend to call certain things that aren't the same brand name by that name. Kleenex, for example. Handmade Kleenex. Well, it's technically a Puffs.
Yeah, Q-tip, Kleenex. Well, can you Xerox this for me? And nobody owns a Xerox. So, yeah.
Yep. So you've got to enforce it. And if you, and those are some examples of enforcing it. But if you find somebody using your name, you've got to send a cease and desist. I was litigating a case not too long ago where we sent a cease and desist. It was a very nice cease and desist saying, please stop using our name. The other side didn't stop. And it turned into a bit of a social media quagmire going back and forth. And a lot of people on social media, they don't understand this stuff, which is good that you're having this podcast, because a lot of people thought that my client was being greedy or a jerk, that they were, how could you tell this other person to stop using your name? You are such a greedy jerk. Well, it wasn't that, and we ended up running a PR campaign to counteract the other side's allegations on social media, which cleared things up to a degree. I mean, there was some damage still done, but it helped to clear things up. Basically saying, look, y'all have to understand, we're not trying to be greedy. We're not trying to be a jerk. But if we don't enforce our trademark, we will lose it. And the reason is because of that genericide issue I talked about. If you let everybody use your trademark, at a certain point, somebody's going to say, you let everybody use it, you don't own it anymore. If you let another band use your trademark, yeah, I know that there's another band called, whatever, that's 4 states over. We're probably never going to play the same venues. It doesn't matter. You could still lose your trademark. And they could, on the other hand, they could go register their trademark before you, even though you may have been using yours for longer, and now they may have the right to use your trademark over you. So the other thing I will say is that trademarks in general are an interstate thing. I talked at the very beginning that there's a state trademark and there's a federal trademark. If you're selling your music on Spotify or Apple or Amazon, generally you have the ability to get that federal trademark. That's a United States creation. There is a way to confirm your trademark in other countries, but there's a process that you have to go through. So if you're trying to be international with your music, you can do that. But there is no such thing as like a one-stop shop where you can just say, boop, I'm applying for a worldwide trademark and now I've got the worldwide trademark. It's a country by country creation.
All right. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on. This is a great episode. I knew you'd be a good guest because you know more about this than anybody I know. We are having part 2 will be coming up. It's going to be about just music business basics. So stay tuned for that. And anything you want to tie up last, or is that about good for you for this one?
If anybody needs to contact an entertainment attorney, I think that we'll have my contact information in maybe the comments here or the some sort of written materials. But I'm Bryan Kroes with Hurtado Zimmerman SC in Wisconsin. And, feel free to look me up and reach out.
All right. Well, thanks again. And like I said, stay tuned for the second part. Everybody have a great day.